A very warm welcome to this session this afternoon, Catching the Customer Before They Fall. Just before I ask the panel to introduce themselves, if I could remind you, if you wanted to ask any questions, do please use the Slido. We're the yellow room. If you put your questions down in the green or the blue room, you might get a fine answer, but you're not going to hear it here. So just bear that in mind. We've got about 30 minutes on the clock, so feel free just to get those questions out as soon as the conversation begins. Perhaps if I could start at the far side. Joe, did you want to just introduce yourself, and then Dennis and Momazil will go through the queue.
Thank you, Eric. And great to be with you all today. I guess I'm probably the wild card on your panel because I am not from a financial institution. I have the privilege of running the Institute of Customer Service. And that's an organisation that's pan-sector, but we work a lot with many of you in the room as well. So great to be with you today.
Thanks, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dennis Sanford-Casey. I'm Head of Data and Collection Strategy within the Equifax business. So my role is working with clients like yourself, understanding your data processes and how we can deploy them in everywhere from pre-arrears to early stage and late stage collection strategy, understanding propensity to pay and people's current situations around their sort of financial position.
Thanks, Dennis.
Good afternoon, everybody. Muzammil Shabadin from SAS. Formerly, I was Chief Risk Officer at Dudley Building Society in the society sector. Previous to that, 7 years with Deloitte and Barclays, as well as G Money before that. All the time in credit risk management, portfolio credit risk, second line, and at my CRO role, obviously. Here at SAS, we are proud to have our leading data analytics platform. And on top of that, we deploy risk solutions, fraud, and customer intelligence. So I'm coming at it from a prudential, credit risk, and enterprise risk perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Momazil. And myself, as you can see from the screen, I'm the MD responsible for personal finance at UK Finance. I'm also the Vice Chair of a building society and involved with an organisation called Registry Trust. Some of you might know we process county court judgments and then pass them on to credit reference agencies. So full disclosure, hopefully you can all hear us at the back. If you can't, if we're not enunciating sufficiently, do please raise a hand and we'll try to project. I wonder perhaps though, if we might start in catching a customer before they fall. There's a school of thought, Joe, that actually it's all about communication. When we're talking to customers, they start to get into financial difficulty. There needs to be confidence that that discussion is going to be well received. So more broadly, how do you feel society perceives, I guess, industry and within that financial services?
It's a really good point, and communication is key, and everybody in this room will know that. And if you look at a lot of our data, about 20% of, we do something called the UK CSI, and about 20% of people are reporting feeling really squeezed at the moment, really feeling under pressure. And what we saw, interestingly, Eric, through COVID, was the more outreach that organisations did, the better. So there's definitely something about stepping in before we get into this issue. And I think there's definitely something around how that is done. So, in terms of that kind of sense of helping the person own the issue or the problem, not obviously taking it away, but also helping them to face up to the fact that they have got that issue or particular problem. Where organisations have done that, clearly we get much, much better results. So, and one thing I would say is overall at the moment, customer satisfaction in the UK is really under pressure. And we're seeing that across all industry sectors, but we're also seeing it in the finance sector. So there is something, the balance between human intervention and technological intervention, particularly around these sensitive areas, is really, really important. So the comms side of this, for me, Eric, is critical.
Thanks, Joe. And across the sector, a lot has been done to encourage customers, consumers to speak to their lenders. I know Nationwide are present in the room. HSBC have done the same. UK Finance, but still there's a stigma. So, Dennis, some of that does relate to credit reference agencies. Some of that is a concern about what the damage might be to me if I was to start that conversation. How would we address that?
Yeah, I think that the point that Joe makes is really interesting. It's a combination of technology and also data coming together to be able to reach out with the correct messaging. There's a lot of advice out there that people look to. So, for example, if you take consumers who are getting into problems, they tend to speak to their mate down the pub for advice. They go to TikTok. TikTok is a massive source of advice now. And very often that advice they can see is incorrect. So that's where the education part comes in, because you're right, people get very concerned about the fact that actually, if I don't pay, or even if I just hide away, my credit file is going to be less impacted. If I actually actively do something, I may cause more damage, which is incorrect. So ultimately, it's about using the data at your disposal to understand someone that's in potentially declining situation, how you can then engage them, what you're going to say to them, the tone of voice, the way you reach out, what you offer them, and the journey you put them through. That's the bit that can make the difference. Because if you can get them to go, for example, on an affordability journey, recognize there's a problem early, you can then intervene, help out, and support the individual correctly.
I'm going to stick with you for a minute because the questions come through about what the most significant indicator might be. I think we'll have our views on that, but from a data perspective, and then I'll turn to you, Mademoiselle, because then we can talk about how the technology might interrogate that for it. But from a data perspective, what would you say? Is there a killer factor?
As in when somebody's struggling financially, is there kind of one key indicator to look for? I'm going to say no to that, partly because when you look at the products and how they're built, and you start to understand particularly vulnerability, it's not a single event you're looking for. And part of that is because as people get into financial difficulty, it tends not to be one thing. What you tend to find is they're using one credit card to pay off another credit card, or applying for more credit, or they've moved house. So there's multiple events that are triggering in the background. One of the key things you are looking for is how credit hungry are they? That's always a good indicator. So if someone is highly utilized and they're credit hungry at the same time, then they are really starting to show signs of struggle. So you haven't got one factor, but there are certain key areas such as being credit hungry, being highly overutilized, and being over leveraged are probably the core ones that you'd be looking at within the data sets.
Yeah, so Mademoiselle, look, we've opened the conversation very much with the need for empathy, very much on the qualitative side of the conversation. You're an expert in the systems analytics. How is it that you can apply technologies that take us through the mathematics and perhaps the more systematic approach to reach customers in a way that they're going to respond positively?
A very simple question, which we all struggle with on a daily basis. So to try and maybe structure it a little bit, why don't we take an outside-in lens, and then we'll take an inside-out lens. So what do I mean by outside-in? Customer experience. So we've been talking just up to now, catching the customer before they fall. For me, I think our principle, our vision should be trying to catch the customer way before they fall. So qualitatively and quantitatively, of course, there's different things that a lot of you in the room are doing, indeed quite a lot of them myself in my previous roles. I think the key is, as has been mentioned by panel already, is the extent to which it's a joined-up thinking process. So that outside-in lens, taking the appropriate voice of the customer to start very much before they even decide to open a credit product with ourselves, and then using that information, which is largely qualitative, prescriptive, and how to then incorporate that within front-end strategies as well as then through the life cycle. So that's where the inside-out lens comes in, which is around, if I can string up my, let's call it marketing or front-end sort of customer intelligence period of the life cycle, plus obviously a fraud aspect during as well, but then alongside the risk management metrics that I'm going to use regularly throughout. I think quite often it's a siloed impact, and that kind of left hand, right hand don't know what each other are doing. That adds to a lot of the customer's frustration, which in some cases can indeed exacerbate the situation. So for me, outside in, make sure you know that voice of the customer very much before they become a customer, and secondly, inside out, how can I join up those different aspects of my portfolio credit life cycle and make sure that they're all effectively talking about the same customer, and take appropriate views across the life cycle as to how is the customer feeling. Super simple.
Good. Joe?
Yeah, can I just build on that? Because I think it's a really important point, particularly around trust. Because, if we're thinking about, we're asking a customer, a consumer to trust us, really. We're asking them to contact and be much more open. And if you look at the UK CSI, what you'll see is there's 26 different measures, and the one that relates strongly or most to the customer experience or the satisfaction in that is trust. And one of the things that I do think is really important in a world that's trusting a lot less, and being frightened or being scared to give you my data or not engaging is a really, really big issue. And also on the back of that, we've gone through a period where we've tried to take friction, haven't we, out of the systems, because that's what we want. We want less friction. And actually, we're now having to put more friction back in. So that can be more irritating too for the customer experience. So there is really something for me about how we understand the journey, as we've talked about, the journey of that customer, how they're going through that, what motivates them, why certain things will be more stressful than others, all of that in order to build a relationship. Because if we don't build a relationship with the customer, then it just becomes a transaction. And if it's just a transaction, then we'll struggle to do anything with the customer, let alone collect debt. So for me, it's about that overarching relationship.
Thank you. Dennis, I want to bring you in, if I may, because one of the questions that's come through is around what the optimal level of contact might be. So when does it become overbearing? I think from learned experience through the pandemic, we crossed something of a Rubicon, proactive outreach to ask if a customer needed help and support, which was quite divisive previously, is something we've moved beyond. But nonetheless, the point remains, how much is too much in terms of communication?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the point that Joe raises there is key around trust again, because if you reach out too early or too late, but get your messaging wrong, the response you get, the reaction you get, is not going to be right. So it's not so much the optimal, but it's the right way of engaging. It's the fact, do you understand what your customer's going through? You know, when a customer loses their job, for example, and has got lower income, what actually are their priorities? If they've got children, their priorities will be very different for somebody who doesn't have children. So does the business understand they've got children? And does the business understand the fact that actually they're going to be paying for school fees potentially, or they're going to be paying for dance lessons? And all of that will be prioritized above financial services. So actually, if someone just reaches out and says, hey, are you okay? Can you pay us? They're probably not going to respond. But actually, if the messaging is from the data, we can see it looks like you appear to be having some kind of financial problems, or you are struggling, or can we help? You know, just can we help? Can we help with your affordability? The messaging is the critical part. So, for example, when we talk about optimal sort of timing, there's an element of going, yeah, you can go early, and you can use the data, and you can have an outreach program to try and engage them. But if you get the wording wrong, you won't create the trust, and therefore you won't get the response. So when it says necessarily an optimal, it's more to do with the messaging and making sure that part is correct.
And I think also, you know, we have a multiplicity of channels these days, so the direct phone call might perhaps be a little bit more forthright than a less intrusive comms message to start with, and that escalation process should also, I guess, form part of those strategies. How does the tech help with those sort of approaches? So,
technology, I believe, is an enabler for good, and subject to all the, so I'm a risk professional, I'll hand out my first caveat, so subject to obviously the appropriate data protection qualifications being received, etc. I think, first of all, let's say it the other way around. You don't just throw technology at a problem. And I'm from SAS, right? So I'm saying this, but quite proudly, because it's about having responsible usage of technology and responsible AI, for example. There's many case studies where it's gone wrong, but fortunately many case studies where it's gone right as well. I think the key for me would be having the right interaction, again, down to those customer journeys being mapped appropriately with some pretty tight scope to start with. And then putting the appropriate technology, you know, we're all Gen AI, it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention it, working from SAS, as well as the other sort of more automation, you know, ML, this kind of stuff. So really the technology you throw at it, whatever, there's a tool bag and we will reach in, but it needs to be fit for purpose. I've seen many instances when I was employed by Deloitte where on an internal audit basis, the root cause is you had the wrong tool for the wrong job in terms of interaction or, in this case, customer contact strategy. Just slightly related, if I may, just one of the points mentioned here, I think the key word to take away here, guys, is trust. So we just had a comment which is absolutely right as well, going sort of A to Z in terms of have the appropriate communication strategy and I show empathy, etc. It's going to develop trust. But remember, that's not a straight line, that's a circle. So I need to actually develop the trust first, back to Joe's point, in terms of trust this brand, etc., or trust this person who's the CEO, etc. And then that sort of precipitates down from there. So make sure you're doing it A to Z as well as Z to A.
Thanks, Moses. I guess that then prompts the question, one of the, and please, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense at all, but as the question was posed, as the ostrich that just does not want to engage, and how do we demonstrate the value? So we're getting to perhaps the more difficult edge cases here, but nonetheless, if we want to respect our responsibilities under the consumer duty, we have to find the way. So I just wonder, thoughts, perhaps Dennis, what would you suggest?
Yeah, that's a really interesting area, that kind of non-engaging group. And the word Muzzamil used was toolkit, and what's in your toolkit becomes really critical. So being able to reach out, try and get them to engage. Now, for example, as you've touched on, that there isn't just one method. There isn't just phone calls or just letters. You can combine them. So, for example, you may decide to use a letter to reach out, to try and engage, but offer the customer a QR code to have the route to go back in digitally. Because that's maybe what they want to do. Rather than speak to somebody, they want to be on a computer, on a system at night, sitting in their living room under their own terms. So you can start to think about that area. You can then start to use partners as well. Start to look at companies that you work with. Do they specialise in sort of starting to reach out? Do they try and engage, particularly those in financial difficulty who are perceived as vulnerable? There are companies out there that will specialise in those areas. So when you look at your toolkit, it's about understanding, is the data telling you what you want to know about your customer? Do you understand them? Have you then got enough from that customer journey that you've created to realise what could have changed in their life from the point you've taken them on to the point now? Have you got the right contact details? And if you have, how are you going to try and reach out? How are you going to try and engage them, either digitally or via the phone or via a letter or via a combination of all of them? And if they are still not responding, then you can potentially have partners you can work with to try and help. Ultimately, we're human beings, and if we really decide not to engage in that, it's a difficult area because consumer duty wants businesses to work in a particular way that's best for the consumer. But if the consumer just is not responding, then yeah, you have to start looking at maybe a bit more traditional world of debt collection and start going down slightly stricter routes.
Yeah.
Okay, just before we go down those stricter routes, Joe, I wouldn't mind bringing you in. Is there something more broadly that in other sectors we might learn from?
Yeah, I absolutely think it is, because the reality is this is happening in the finance sector. It's happening with my utility bill, it's happening with my water bill, and it's really interesting when we talk outside of sector, this comes up, not as much as you might think, but it certainly is coming up. And the big thing is around stigma. I don't want to admit that I can't pay my bill, you know, or that whole kind of piece. So there is something really interesting for me about how that outreach is done, the different channels, the different approaches. And there is something for me around, you know, this is really interesting. I had a letter once from a credit collection company. It terrified the hell out of me. It wasn't actually for me. Someone had used a credit card of mine, scammed it, blah, blah, blah. But the whole wording, how that actually made was just a sheer panic in terms of flight, of fear. So that was no way was that going to be really engaging me. So there is something really important, and I know we're saying the same thing, but this is, you know, around the counselling, around the support for people, around the conversation, which means that you need very highly trained, empathetic people that are really walking in the shoes of probably where some of these people are. And there's no quick route to that. There's no, you know, tech-based solution. The tech can help us to identify those issues, but how you show up. And the other connection for me, because I know you want to go into this a bit more, it's about reputation. I always think risk and reputation are so hugely linked. And, you know, in a world, again, where trust is low, reputational damage is also quite a big issue. So how we are doing this and how we're turning up, I think is going to be very important for the reputation of any of our organisations. So I think that's another eye. It's not just about collecting, it's about the impact that we're trying to create and what type of brand and our purpose that we're trying to demonstrate. So key things.
Unless we forget, of course, it's commonplace that if one has an issue, one will tell 10, 12 individuals of that bad experience, and if it's a good experience, far fewer. So there's a multiplier, an exponential effect in that we need to be alive to. Mumsy, did you have some thoughts on that? And I want to move us on. So perhaps just before you respond, Dennis, Joe, how about a slightly more radical thought? Should this be for the providers of the credit, or should it be for FCA-regulated debt advisors? That step back, that autonomy. So I'll come to you in a second, but Mademoiselle first.
So just to throw perhaps don't want to jump to solutions, but as an example, some of our clients that we work with, the story resonated with me. So in my collection shop, I've got some resource, and they're expensive resource and quite highly skilled, but I need to deploy them efficiently. So how do I do that? So Joe's just said, well, you need to traditionally, on that sort of fringe group, have a bit more of a longer conversation, a bit more involved, a bit more personalized. Absolutely. Well, guess what? I run the shop. I need more time for that, or I need collectors and I can't afford them. So what we're trying to do is say, well, that's sort of symptomatic of something. So what's the cause? Maybe the cause is something didn't happen before they fell or before they started to fall. So we actually don't deploy our analytical and automation tools at this point in the collections arena or pre-collections. Try and do something a bit earlier on. So I won't go into the numbers, but we can actually sort of decrease the volumes that are going in quite materially in some cases to allow that time to be spent more effectively. So just an example of something that you probably know of, but I thought that resonated.
Now, the questions are coming in thick and fast, and I do want to cover as many as possible. So briefly, if I may, what about bringing in a third party, a professional, an independent advisor, rather than the lender themselves? I'd be interested in your perspectives. Dennis, perhaps if I start with you first.
Yeah, okay. I think there's already some of that in place for a lot of companies, and having the ability to go through the journey is critical. You can't just bring them in at the wrong stage, because actually you do genuinely need to understand about the customer you're dealing with. Are they deliberately avoiding paying debts because some people do, or are they actually genuinely in financial problems and need the right support? And the company, the originating lender, is the one that has the most information. It's their customer. They know how long they've been a customer for. They know how the customer's behaved in the past. And actually they, as a regulated business, should also have the right to then go through a process, try and engage the customer, and if necessary, down debt collection. And if the customer engages, then hand them off to the outside independent regulated debt advisor, for example, which is what a lot of companies do anyway. So I don't think that's too radical.
Yeah, and I, to be honest with you, Eric, would agree with that. You own the customer. That is your responsibility. But you work in partnership with the relative and the most experienced people you possibly can be in order to be able to get that right outcome. But I think it's the company's responsibility working in partnership with others.
I'm going to stick with you for a second on that point of responsibility. Where's the division between the consumer's responsibility and the lender's responsibility? Be very interested in your view. And then I've got some more challenging questions for you, Dennis and Mademoiselle, to follow. So, okay. Joe, responsibility.
It's a really good question. And the first thing to say is the customer's not always right. And you've heard me say that many times, Eric. And you have to be responsible for yourself. That you can't just suddenly go out and buy that Lamborghini and then wonder how I'm going to pay it. That's just not reality. So, that's where that balance lies. I guess the responsibility for the organisation is to check that out as much as you can, but there's a big responsibility that we're not lying or, not being inappropriate as customers. So it's about finding out as much as you possibly can about that customer, but actually there is a responsibility, of course, for the customer to behave appropriately. And it is interesting at the moment around that balance, because sometimes that balance is not quite right. Eric, has a completely different subject, but the Service with Respect campaign really shows that to me, about the amount of abuse that people are having to experience in companies when customers don't like the response they're getting. So it is a balance, absolutely.
And that's a challenge relative to consumer duty, and that gets very difficult when consumers have a mismatch in expectation for what they want to achieve in their financial ambitions relative to what's possible. And that's where there really needs to be a degree of clarity and leadership for all of our colleagues in businesses around what a good outcome might be. That good outcome might not be the distribution of credit. It might actually be some other solution. But that's not the point I wanted to raise with you, Dennis. A fascinating question's come up regarding open banking and the extent to which that could provide some predictive data. Could we broaden that perhaps to the big data blocks that the 3 credit reference agencies have, Cato, the current account turnover data? How do you think that could help with predictive effects?
Yeah, okay, so when you broaden it, obviously you have all of your data assets, and of course, from the likes of Cato, for example, is accessed at a different point in time compared to, for example, open banking. Because open banking is consent explicit. So when you have your big bureau data and you're looking at, for example, the insight data, which is the financial data reported to the bureaus, you're looking at the registry trust data, you're looking at search type data. All of that gives you a lot of predictive information around the bureau view of an individual. And that's really key, because that is showing you, what's going on with their lending. Are they applying for too much credit? Are they getting more overutilized? And that's that start of that journey as to how are you going to engage them? What messaging are you going to say? Because ideally, yes, then you get into, if they do engage you and you put them on an affordability journey, that's where the likes of open banking come in. And that can also be very predictive, because open banking can start to show you, actually, this person's on a particular kind of benefit, possibly a bereavement type benefit. Okay, so they've had a loss in their life, and actually that could be impacting their finances. It can start to show you other levels, other markers. But one of the key things with open banking at this point in time is you need to have engagement with the customer. So if you go back to those customers that aren't engaging, it's no use at all. But for those that are, absolutely, as part of that toolkit, you've got your bureau data, you've got your internal data that allows you to engage, get some open banking data, and really understand the position the customer is in.
Yeah, so that's the hard data, and those are the numbers. Mademoiselle, there's a question here. Someone must have heard us talking in the margins, because it's all about, what about the intonation of voice? What about other things that technology can pick up these days? I think it would be really useful if you could share some thoughts around the way the industry's moving in that space.
Yes, I'm conscious not to tell grandmothers to suck eggs on this one, because I think there's a lot that's quite well publicized. Again, unfortunately, both bad news as well as good news in terms of use of these tools effectively. But I think the current speech on the screen aside, it's not doing a very good job, but there are other speech recognition or text recognition software, obviously SAS has some, that, see, I'm hesitant because it's all just a model, right? So when you then start to talk about model risk and how to manage the sort of inputs being healthy enough and making sure that they continue to stay healthy and there's no sort of divergence. So, I mean, we're probably a little bit short on time. I can talk for hours on this stuff, as you'd expect, as well as my colleagues. Once again, I think right tool for the right job, make sure it's governed, make sure you know what's going in, so there's no garbage in, garbage out risk, or at least it's minimized, and make sure that your end consumer, your customer, your member knows what you're using their data for, whether it's externally sourced or whether it's internal. I don't think I've told you anything too different or new there, but I always go back to sort of first principles.
So catch this guy in the margins. I'm sure over a cup of coffee he'd be more than happy to describe in somewhat more detail, outside in, inside out. Remove the stigma, open the communication, build the trust, and I think those are the lessons that Joe, Dennis and Mademoiselle have shared with us this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found that at least part of that was insightful and informative as you take that back into your respective businesses. Perhaps I could ask you to join me in a warm hand for our panel this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric, Joe, Dennis, and Muzamil. Now we have a lightning talk, so please join me in welcoming Carl Riches, Sales Director, Product Sales and Consulting at Equifax, who's going to talk about how to get a 360-degree view of affordability.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm only here for 5 minutes. Please don't leave. You may as well turn the subtitles off for me. I've just got no chance. It's amazing to see so many friendly and familiar faces. I'm delighted to be here. And I want to start today's lightning talk by asking a question in typical Equifax style. What if? What if you could approve more customers on lower affordability? And what if you could do that whilst making your affordability assessments fairer, more inclusive, and with better consumer outcomes? My name is Carl Riches, Sales Director at Equifax, and I've been working for the last several years helping clients understand and adopt open banking. I'm here today to answer those what-if questions using the power of differentiated data. At Equifax, we're obsessed with combining data in new and innovative ways in order to uncover new business insights for our clients. 3 years ago, Equifax acquired AccountScore, the UK's most transparent and leading categorization engine, because we knew that as open banking adoptions grew, bank transaction insights would become an increasingly important part of our multi-data strategy. And ever since that investment, we've been creating new insights that blend both bureau and open banking data together to drive better outcomes for our clients and our customers. Our newest solution, Affordability 360, takes multi-data further than ever before and helps clients say yes to more customers with confidence by seamlessly blending 3 distinct affordability data sets together. Let's see how it works. We combine data sourced from a consumer's bank account, credit file, ONS, and minimum income standards to create a 360-degree view of affordability. The solution automatically selects the best source of data from open banking or bureau and plugs in any data gaps with modeled affordability when needed. When data sources are blended seamlessly together like this, affordability decisions are more predictive and lead to better consumer outcomes. So how does Affordability 360 deliver a better consumer outcome? Our research showed that assessments using the solution are 37% more predictive of a better consumer outcome. That being the likelihood of a consumer defaulting on any of their credit agreements in the 12 months post-application. Customers approved using Affordability 360 are less likely to go into financial difficulty. Now, I've worked extensively over the last 5 years helping hundreds of clients understand open banking, but it still surprises me to hear that some lenders are concerned about open banking being a data source that would lead them to decline more customers. When developing Affordability 360, we find the exact opposite. That 26% of customers deemed by Cato to be of low income and unaffordable did indeed have sufficient levels of affordability to be approved using the solution. Customers with lower incomes are more likely to be approved using Affordability 360 versus customer declared and modeled data alone.
To assess affordability, lenders need reliable sources of data to verify both income and expenditure. But you can't always rely on a customer's self-declaration or government statistics alone. So getting an accurate view of expenditure can often feel like a guessing game. Equifax are already leading the world in open banking multi-data solutions. And we wondered, what could we achieve if we combined the power of open banking with the very best from different data sources into one single channel? This is why we created Affordability 360. We can help you make lending decisions 40% more predictive and create the most accurate view of your customers' expenditure. Lend to more people with more confidence, easier than ever before, by combining the very best data into a single channel. Open banking from Equifax. Contact us to book a demo by visiting equifax.co.uk/open banking.
Boop. So thank you for listening. I didn't have a lot of time today, just 5 minutes. So if you do want to ask any questions about the Affordability 360 solution, please don't hesitate to come and stop and chat to me. I'm here for all 3 days. Alternatively, we've got a huge stand. Go see one of the amazing Equifax team manning that. I'll also be hosting some Affordability 360 demos and drop-ins tomorrow in the boardroom. Again, if you'd like to see that in action, please do let me know. Thank you very much.